Hey everybody, I'm back. It's been a minute, many of you know. It's good to be back. Today I am joined by my guest, David Pallmann, who is uh, I think I billed you as a reputable Christian apologist, which I think, based out, if anyone's not familiar with your content on your channel, um, Faith Because Reasons, I think that overall, watching your videos, I think you come across as like a very well-read and reasoned guy, is at least the impression that I got. I first became aware of your content more so in the debunking presuppers space. So you've made numerous videos talking about presuppositional arguments, and I just wanted to first of all thank you, David, for that content. I thought that is like much needed, specifically to be coming from other Christians, for some of these presuppers to get through to them. And I think you made well-reasoned, cogent reasons why presuppositionalism is nonsense. So I just wanted to open this up by saying thank you for those videos that you made, David.
It's entirely my pleasure. The crusade against presuppositionalism will not rest on my channel.
Yeah, so that was the first reason I became aware of your channel and your videos, and I really enjoyed those videos. And then I don't remember if this was before or after I became aware of your video, but of your channel, but very somewhere in that window, I saw that you made a video responding to my video on the resurrection, kind of debunking me. And I thought that you did a really good job with that video. We were talking about this a little bit beforehand, but you moved my position a little bit on this, to where before your video, I sort of was listening to like the Bart Ehrmans of the space and everything, and I was thinking that the possibility of an empty tomb was just very implausible, based on some of the arguments that I had heard, some of the historical evidence. And you presented, I thought, some compelling evidence and reasons, like that one specific ossuary of a Jewish man from the same time who was crucified and buried in an ossuary, and we have the archaeological evidence. I thought that, you convinced me, at least for the plausibility of an empty tomb. Now, I want to clarify, I'm not all the way of the position that I think the empty tomb is one of the facts that needs to be explained. It could be, it's plausible, but I'm not there all the way yet. But I think it's, at least, while before your video, I would have said the empty tomb is implausible, I think you've moved the needle up for me at least a bit, to where I'm open-minded about the possibility of an empty tomb. So thank you again for that one as well.
Well, I'm glad you've watched my content. I'm glad you did so in the spirit I intended it. So I appreciate that. I've been aware of you, I think, for a little bit longer, actually. Because, I've been watching some of your debates and stuff going back at least a couple of years. And I've generally appreciated, your demeanor and stuff on things. So it's good to finally connect and, have a live conversation.
Yeah, well, thanks for being here. So, and we're already getting some pretty funny comments about next up I'm converting to Christianity. We'll see if after this conversation, I might be swayed by the evidence for the resurrection. And then we've got Ivan Tchaikovsky over here, back with a member for 17 months. I mean, I'm really, really grateful, Ivan, especially for like the lapse of content I've had on the channel. So yeah, thank you. And anyone, by the way, if you've got questions for either of us, we will be going over that towards the end of the video. So super chat it if you really want us to see the question, or just sort of ask your question towards the end. The structure for today that we were thinking was, for the first half, we're going to be talking about really the reason why I reached out to David. I think originally I reached out, maybe, or it was a while ago that we were setting this up, by the way. And I had seen a video of Dave's where he was doing a debate with friends of the channel, Reasons to Doubt, about intelligent design and evolution. And mind you, this was, I think, 6 years ago, in 2019 or so. And, I think a lot of your position has changed over time, but you had made arguments in favor of intelligent design where it just set me off. I was like, I got to talk to this guy. I mean, he's going through irreducible complexity, abiogenesis. Like, I needed to get in there. Like, put me in, coach. And so I reached out to him, and, the evolution is not your sort of main focus. And you focus more on the sort of, reliability of the Gospels, biblical scholarship, like early
precept sucks.
Yes, exactly. And so I think we decided to do it sort of like in the first half, we'll talk about evolution and intelligent design. In the second half, we'll talk more about the historical evidence for the resurrection. But in both cases, we're going to be trying to make a point of, here is the conclusion that is more in line with the evidence we have, either that be for evolution or for the resurrection historicity. So that's how we're going to split this apart, first half, second half. So in the first half, we're going to be talking about intelligent design and evolution. So I thought, since it's been such a long time since you sort of touched on this topic, I thought it might be helpful to start by maybe you summarizing where your current position is in regards to intelligent design, evolution, and just sort of go from there.
Sure, fair enough. So people who know me know that my father pastors in a very conservative fundamentalist Baptist denomination. And so the only apologetics I was taught was young earth creationist apologetics. So it was all stuff from Institute for Creation Research, Answers in Genesis. That was about the extent of my apologetic knowledge through till probably I was about 16 or 17. So it was impressed upon me for my entire life that it's very important to Christianity that evolution be false and that young earth creationism be true. Now, when I went off to college, I began wrestling with some of these things. I had what you might consider a bit of a crisis of faith. I was gradually swayed over to an old earth creationist position by people like Hugh Ross and so on and so forth. I thought I was being edgy at the time, being the guy at Bible college who was an old earth creationist.
So that was a minority position then at your institution?
Yeah, I didn't last there long. They booted me after 2 years.
Oh, wow.
Not exclusively over that. It was kind of, once you start giving up one thing that you were really close to you begin to open up to other things. And so snowballs. And eventually, I just got so far from the fundamental Baptists that they were like, yeah, we're done with you. So, I actually got booted out of Bible college after 2 years. But I came around to an old earth creationist position. But I was still pretty resistant on the evolution stuff. Reading the works of intelligent design proponents was sort of instrumental for me there, because it wasn't all it's just what the Bible says, so we're just going to set ourselves to the task of explaining away everything from science because the Bible says so. That wasn't what I was getting from intelligent design. It was no, on its own merits, the scientific evidence supports kind of an alternative paradigm. So I preferred that way of looking at it. I was pretty enthusiastic about that. So as I've, matured somewhat more from that, and I should say that was when I made those initial videos. I had that debate. That was my first debate, by the way. The one.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, that was my first ever debate. So perhaps not my best performance. But so that's about 6-7 years ago. That was one of the first studies I did, and so I put it together in a video series. I was just starting at my YouTube channel, and I was like, wow, what the heck, I'll get my research out there. So if you press me now, where I'm going to stand on this is that probably if you push me, I'll still hold to broadly the same positions I held to 6 years ago on that, but much less dogmatically. So I'm a lot more open, particularly on the issue of common descent. I don't affirm it, and I'm sure we'll get into some of the reasons for that today. So I still don't affirm common descent. I'm a lot more open to that, and I am convinced that you can hold to a version of common descent and still hold to intelligent design. So those aren't necessarily in conflict with one another. So there's kind of two avenues we could go down there. Kind of the big moment for me was, I'm sure you're familiar with Jackson Wheat, because he was kind of the big evolution dog on YouTube, 6-7 years ago. He responded to my video on common descent, and then we had a subsequent conversation that we set up. Probably went on for 2-3 hours. I don't think that's available anywhere. I think we kept it as
I'm sorry I missed that. Yeah, I couldn't find that discussion.
Yeah, that one might have never. I think I might have deliberately asked to keep that one private. It's been so long, I don't remember. But in any case, That was really what was like, all right, there's a lot of material here and the material updates constantly, right? It's not like history where it's pretty stable. Occasionally you get new stuff, but like science, it's constant new stuff coming in.
Like just this year, they just found new trove of fossils from before the Cambrian, where it was the first time that I think there were 2 phyla that were only known from the Cambrian explosion onward that now we found before the Cambrian that just came out this year. It was like, or not even phyla. It was like the first bilaterian found before Cambrians. Like we are bilaterians, so that's kind of relevant to us. And I mean, the year before that, there was another study finding some new phyla predating the Cambrian explosion. So it's like every year, you're right, it's constantly updating.
Yeah. And so kind of what the conversation with Jackson convinced me of was that, all right, probably evolutionary biology. The only reason I have a dog in this fight is because I was raised young Earth creationist. And so for that, I thought it was important. By that point, I was pretty convinced. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, that's what I was gonna ask you too, because I had never really thought of evolution as being sort of like a salvation issue for Christians. But when you were talking about how a lot of your initial like pushback against evolution and towards intelligent design after you had your period of sort of questioning things like young Earth creationism was because of the works that you had been reading from intelligent design proponents, like maybe like Stephen Meyer or those types of apologists that sort of try to approach it from sort of like, they want to talk about evidence, they want to try to talk about science, that kind of angle. When you were reading those, is that sort of how you were being introduced to these scientific topics, or did you receive an education in evolution before that?
So I was homeschooled, and so I did learn about evolution, but it was from the perspective of here's why it's wrong. So I very quickly learned much of what I had been taught about evolution was false. It is entirely possible to this day I have conceptions that are false. Maybe this conversation will reveal some of that. I have certainly updated a lot of it from what I was taught. But if you're asking, like, did I receive a basic, secular education on evolutionary biology? No, that never happened.
Okay. Yeah. So, it makes sort of more sense where you're coming from then, I guess. So in the initial video that I had seen from you, you sort of laid out 3 major lines of argumentation for intelligent design. I thought you worded it quite well in terms of, you were saying like these 3 lines of arguments show like that the aspects of life that was designed or could not have arisen naturally or something. I think the first thing that you brought up was abiogenesis. The second one was irreducible complexity. And then the third thing, from my understanding, is that you were saying like the incongruencies in the fossil record is what I understood the third point to be. I was a little unshaky.
Probably something to the effect of like the origin of new like body plans, or something to that effect.
Yeah. So I wanted to touch base on those 3 arguments. Do you still feel like those are the 3 big arguments that you would say sway you towards intelligent design and away from evolution, or have you progressed on those arguments at all?
Origin of life is probably going to be the strongest one. Okay. Probably the second strongest is going to be, I still am iffy about the common descent issue. And so if you do get complex body plans, basically appearing ex nihilo in the fossil record, that I think would be indicative that there's intelligence at play. The one I backed off of the most would probably be the irreducible complexity one. We can still talk about that one if you want, but it's not, honestly, if I was going to redo that debate, I wouldn't even bring that one up today. Okay. Sort of how little confidence I have in that argument currently.
Well, cool. So yeah, we'll start with the abiogenesis one, because this is, I think, the easiest one to touch on, because I think this is just an entirely separate topic to evolution. Like, and people know on this channel, abiogenesis is one of my favorite topics to talk about. I have lots of debates on abiogenesis, and it's like just one of my favorite subjects in general. But I just think it's a completely separate topic to evolution. So, and this is how I would illustrate that, right? If I were to just, for the sake of the argument, say abiogenesis from natural mechanisms is impossible, and you need to have some sort of intelligent designer to create the first life. if I were to just grant that, it doesn't change one thing about evolution. Like it would still be, you create like some sort of single cell life or something in some sort of intelligent design process, and then from there that single cell then evolves into life as we know it today. So it just seems to me that it just is a totally separate, it doesn't weigh on evolution or its veracity at all. It's just my take on it.
So strictly speaking, I agree with you if we're talking about evolution as like a historical thesis, right? So if we're talking about the thesis of common descent or descent with modification, something like that, then yes, you could affirm sort of intelligent design at the origin of life, at the base of life, and then say that nevertheless, sort of the history of life developed broadly the way that scientists tend to think these days. Now, I do think it would have ramifications for whether or not we think that that process is unguided. That's not perhaps an entailment of evolution per se, but it's often, I guess, assumed in there. And so if you do think that like the origin of life, that there is an intelligent design, I think that's going to have at least theistic implications. And so I think that's going to pressure the strictly unguided nature of it. And maybe you'd say that's not required. That's a move you could make there.
I tend to push back on the rhetoric that evolution is an unguided process, because I would say that like the environment is guiding the evolution through, like the natural selection is the guide, right? Like, so like I would push back on saying that it's an unguided process, because it certainly is guided towards optimizing for the environment. But
you wouldn't say guided by like an external intelligence.
Yes. Okay. So like, yeah, I guess I would just, I don't really see that as being necessary for evolution.
I agree. Again, if we're restricting it to the historical thesis, then
well, it's not really guided by an intelligence. Then I guess would be the proper way to specify that. But again, like basically all of the evidence that would lead us to conclude that evolution happened is unchanged by whether or not abiogenesis happened with or without a designer. So that was my point basically on that. It's like the actual state of the evidence that's causing us to make this conclusion is completely unaffected by abiogenesis. So that's why I just thought it's, if you want to say that it's our current lack of a consensus theory or model for abiogenesis is evidence for intelligent design, I mean, maybe I would concede that for the origin of life, but not for the evolution of life, because again, I think the evidence for the evolution of life is pretty strong, independent of how life originated.
Yeah, fair enough. So yeah, we could just talk about the historical side of it. In that debate, I think I was specifically arguing for intelligent design, and so that's why I brought up origin of life. I don't remember if I said it in the debate or not, but certainly my position now would be basically I would agree with what you said. Okay. I don't think the putative inability of naturalism to explain the origin of life would be an objection to evolutionary theory.
And I just do want to clarify that I do love having the debate on abiogenesis, and I do like arguing this topic, but I just like, since we're only doing about like 45 minutes for each half here, I wanted to make sure that we were drilling down on evolution. So yeah, maybe sometime later we can talk about abiogenesis if you want, because I do have plenty of thoughts on abiogenesis and the current state of evidence and what it suggests and things like that. I mean, like I said, it's one of my favorite fields. We can just touch on, since you said you sort of moved away from this topic more so, the irreducible complexity thing. We can just touch on that a little bit. The only point that I wanted to bring up was that you said pretty emphatically, again, like 6-7 years ago, so I'm not trying to pin this on you now, but you had said, Darwinian mechanisms cannot explain irreducibly complex systems. Like you can't, these irreducibly complex systems cannot evolve. So is that what you say, that you have sort of backed off now and you're sort of more open or willing to concede that evolutionary mechanisms can generate irreducibly complex systems?
So my thinking on this has more so been that, like the broad philosophical point there's correct, that like if there are irreducibly complex systems, it's doubtful that sort of Darwinian mechanisms can explain that. Where I've become less sort of optimistic is that there are examples of irreducibly complex systems.
Fascinating. Okay. Because I was going to go from the exact sort of opposite approach. Mainly was to just take an operational definition of an irreducibly complex system to be any such system where if you remove one of its components, it can no longer function. Not to just a degree of functionality, but it can't function anymore. And I was just going to take that as the operational definition for irreducible complexity. And then I was going to bring up examples of systems that meet that definition that we know for a fact evolved. So that was my approach to take with it. Not necessarily say that there are no irreducibly complex things, which, again, that is Michael Behe's terminology and is not really recognized terminology in the field. I was just sort of using Behe's terminology.
So I guess we might be saying the same thing in different words, right? When you say that like these systems have evolved, are you like postulating something like co-option theory, or like what exactly are you appealing to? Because that could just be the same thing I mean when I say, oh, in that case, it's not.
Okay. Yeah. So I would say that they were co-opted from like a previous state of the system that didn't have those complex parts necessarily, but was doing a different function. It couldn't do the function that it does now without all those parts, but it could do another function. So for the example, like the bacterial flagellum is one of those systems that is commonly cited as being irreducibly complex. And now we have the evidence for the deep homologies within all the different compartments, the component parts of the flagellum, showing that, oh, well, just these components alone are deeply homologous to like a secretion, like a transmembrane secretion system, or this one forms an ion channel, and when you add it to this secretion system, it makes it rotate like a rotor. And so you can have these different components that are evolving for different functions, and then they're co-opted together to make a new function at the end. So that maybe we are saying the same thing. If you're saying that would not be irreducibly complex to you, then we're just having a different definition.
Yeah. And so I think we are essentially saying the same thing.
Okay.
Now, from what I understand, like proponents of intelligent design they have adduced like other examples of things besides the flagellum that are claimed to be irreducibly complex. But obviously, like the bacterial flagellum was supposed to be like the flagship example. Yeah. I've kind of moved off of that. From what I understand, from my very limited understanding, it does, as best I can tell, seem that there are stories you could tell, such as the co-option view, that would explain that. And so what I just took that to mean is, okay, then it's probably not an irreducibly complex system.
Yeah, I had brought a couple more examples to go over. Like
you can if you want to, because that's probably what your audience is here for. But
a lot of them already know this. Like Dr. Dan is pretty well known for popularizing the HIV anti-tethering system. So, I think everybody agrees, even creationists. To my knowledge, I've never seen anyone disagree that like HIV is a newly evolved virus, like from the 20th century. It hasn't been here since the beginning. That seems to be a fairly consensus or not controversial view. So then when we look at HIV, we notice that compared to SIV, the virus that it evolved from, we see that it has irreducibly complex systems that require 4 different components. Each one of those components is necessary for like this anti-tethering system to work, that if it doesn't have it, it can't infect humans. So it's like we see this step where the evolution of something irreducibly complex is necessary for SIV to evolve into HIV. And we know HIV evolved in the 1900s. So it's like, that was one example. And then the other example that's like, maybe there is somebody that's just like HIV was created in the Garden of Eden at the beginning. Maybe there's somebody out there like that. So then I'm like, okay, here's an example. And I'll link this study for anybody that wants this study. But there's it was actually an origin of life study where they were looking at self-replicating systems becoming self-replicating networks. So they started with just one self-replicating RNA molecule. And then by the end, and they were watching this in a lab, right? So it's uncontroversial. This did evolve. Like it starts from a single replicating RNA, and at the end, it was a self-replicating network of different types of RNAs. So there were 5 different RNA molecules. Each of them had its own unique identity, and none of them could replicate without the others. So all 5 of them were necessary in this network for the entire network to self-replicate. But each one, you remove them, the whole network is dead. So the entire network evolved to be, according to Behe's, that's operational definition of irreducible complexity. It was an irreducibly complex network that we just watched it evolve in a pot in a lab, basically.
Well, yeah, I don't know if you'll find this at all interesting. The explanation that I was taught in my fundamentalist church for the origin of HIV was that God just created it in the 20th century to like judge the gay people. So that was the explanation I was taught.
Oh boy. Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, if it's a separate, independent creation, then that would be sort of, I guess that would be like a miracle in a way. Like that would be some supernatural divine intervention. So wow. And yeah, Dan is actually here, and he said that he is going to need that paper. So I'll have to link that. Let me see if I can just pull that up really quick. Yeah, here it is. Here's the link. And I'll just put this in the live chat here for everybody who's curious. And then, yeah, so this last point, then we'll spend the majority of time, because this seems to be like the point that still maybe is the most sticking or the most salient one for you, is this sort of the emergence of new body plans, or I guess you were saying specifically reflected in the fossil record, right?
Yes, and I also have some skepticism about sort of like morphological arguments and other sorts of arguments for common descent.
Okay.
I'll acknowledge from the outset here, like, I know you've got the way bigger knowledge base than I do on this, so this is just going to be me, like, here's my thoughts from like what study I have done, but like I'm not here to debate that with you as much as be like, here's the pushback I've heard. Like, if you got a response, I'm open to it.
The tables are absolutely going to be turned in the second half of the discussion, where we're going to be talking more about like the Gospels and early church history. And in that regard, you definitely are going to have the larger knowledge base. So it's going to be, the karma is going to reverse.
All right, fair enough. So, I mean, I don't know where you want to begin on this. I know you kind of already brought up in the introduction when we were discussing sort of about like how much new information is always coming out here.
Yeah.
Sort of one of the big sticking points for common descent, or at least universal common descent, was always like issue of the Cambrian explosion. And it seemed like you said there was some new research coming out on that. So, I mean, I don't know if that's where you want to start there. If you want to,
yeah, we can absolutely.
Like why that's supposed to be a challenge, and maybe why you don't think it is.
Yeah. So the Cambrian explosion is sort of emblematic for like the bigger pattern of like these radiation events that we see in the fossil record, where you have maybe a period of stasis of forms, followed by like a radiative burst of like all these new species appearing rapidly in the fossil record over just a handful of millions of years. So that is a pattern that we see repeated. The Cambrian explosion is just sort of like the big, flashy, shiny one that everybody knows. But there's an explosion before the Cambrian explosion that nobody knows. I think it's called the Avalon explosion. There's multiple radiation events after the Cambrian explosion. So it's just sort of like one thing that's emblematic of a pattern. But I think that honestly, this might be an area where learning about the mechanisms of evolution, or sort of how evolution works before encountering like the creationist apologetics might have been a hindrance here, because essentially how we explained it, what we touched on earlier was that the environment is like the guide for evolution and the way that these organisms are changing over time. And so, if basically an organism has a certain niche, like a certain role that they fulfill in its environment, and it's going to have natural selective pressures to best optimize for that niche. And if that niche doesn't change, then those pressures are not going to change. So once it's optimized more and more for that certain ecological niche, we would expect stabilizing selection. Like we would expect selection to stabilize that form, and we would not expect it to change radically, unless its environment changed, and unless that niche changed to where it could no longer be successful fulfilling that role that it always has been. So this would be a driver for a lot of the things that we see in the fossil record. You got a question?
Just one on that. And this might, sorry if you've already clarified on this. Are you here putting forth sort of the idea that evolutionary development doesn't always have to be gradual, because generally, like Cambrian explosion, I've understood this to be a challenge, or like just general radiations in the fossil record are supposed to be a challenge to like sort of neo-Darwinian gradualism. I do think it poses much less of a problem for you if you're not, being a gradualist here.
I mean, so the consensus is sort of like, it's not so much gradualism versus like punctuated equilibrium. The consensus is sort of more of like a both kind of, like, again, the consensus picture is more so like, there's a fitness landscape. Have you heard that terminology before, where you can sort of imagine like it's like a mathematical construction of like a different like a two-dimensional landscape with hills and valleys and things like that. And the idea is that the organisms want to like roll down, like they're rolling down this fitness landscape with their different mutations, their different phenotypes. And once they roll down into a valley, they stay there. And so it's like, I'm not probably explaining this very well, but this is sort of the way that it's conceived of nowadays, is that if the environment doesn't change, if the animal's niche doesn't change, we would not expect a lot of morphological change for that animal. So the example is like a horseshoe crab or a scorpion or something. Those organisms have not had that much anatomical change over a long amount of geologic time, but that's because they haven't needed to. The jobs that they do, the roles that they have in their environment have been the same. They haven't needed to change. But an organism where the roles that they're fulfilling in their environment have changed, right? Or like, say, after a mass extinction event, all of the large animals are gone. So now the small animals can go and occupy all these different roles that they couldn't have occupied earlier. And then they're going to experience much quicker evolutionary, like, phenotypic changes, because they're going to be adapting to these new roles and optimizing to new roles that were not available to them previously. So that would explain these sort of rapid bursts of these radiation events, right? That's at least the sort of explanation for why we would see this pattern.
Yeah, and just to make sure I'm tracking here, and I might have asked the question badly before, but we're postulating more mechanisms, right, than like neo-Darwinian mutation, natural selection, right? So
I mean, there are more mechanisms.
Are you saying that's not necessary to explain? Like, are you saying you think you can explain this with mutation, natural selection?
I mean, ultimately, all of these are going to be like the new information or whatever is going to be derived from mutations. And then it might be sexual selection, it might be natural selection, it might be new niche construction or something, but it's all going to be some interaction with its environment that's going to, select for these forms of these mutants.
So you wouldn't appeal to like maybe like lateral, was this called like lateral gene transfer and stuff in here as well? Because it seemed to me you've got it seems like it's easier to explain sort of more information when you employ those sorts of mechanisms.
So like a horizontal gene transfer is just going to be taking one gene from one bacteria and just like directly putting it into another. So ultimately, yeah, you can say like that could be a new introduction of new genes for that organism, but ultimately that the gene, like the genetic information itself, would have ultimately derived from several rounds of mutations and some selecting pressures. But the point is basically for the Cambrian explosion specifically, the big changes that we see in terms of what would cause these big radiation events at this time in particular are two things, but really they kind of stem from all the same thing, is that we get predation, multicellular predators. In the Ediacaran before this, we don't really see many animals that are capable of eating other animals. In the Cambrian, we do. So when you first have these sort of predator-prey relationships, these are new niches, right? These are new roles that were not present in the previous ecosystem. So that's going to cause a sort of like, like an arms race where the predators are evolving to get really good at killing their prey, and the prey are evolving to get really good at avoiding the predators. So this sort of like creates new pressures that were not there. You have the first instances of exoskeletons, or just skeletons in general, which is going to be really big in terms of preserving the fossils. Like the fossil before the Cambrian is Ediacaran period, and these are all like soft-bodied animals, which can fossilize, but the conditions have to be like immaculately like good to get soft body fossilization. So just the odds of the creatures in the Cambrian preserving as fossils is just so much higher because they've got skeletons.
I do have a question on that, right? Because
Yeah.
I mean, this is like one of sort of Meyer's big pushbacks to that point in Darwin's Doubt. Is he says that like the Ediacaran sort of sediment is like optimal for preserving fossils, right? I think he sort of gives like pictures of even like these microscopic sponges that are sort of preserved. So his counter to like that point would be that like this is like the best kind of sediment for preserving fossils. So if we had sort of Precambrian ancestors, they absolutely would have been preserved here.
Well, yeah. So, and we do have a lot of Precambrian ancestors. Like some of them are pretty difficult to like suss out the predator or the ancestor descendant kind of relationships there, because a lot of the life that we have in Ediacaran is just so different. Like it's got entirely different forms of symmetry to any other kind of life that we see. It's just so radically different. And then in the Cambrian, we still see some really alien-looking forms of life, but we start to see some more recognizable phyla. I think that specifically with the types of sediments that you're talking about, like the Lagerstätten would be what the formations are called, that are the like really perfect fossilization conditions. And we do find that for the Ediacaran, and we do find fossils in it, and we do find like, at least like I said, like this last year they found a brand new trove of Ediacaran fossils that had been unaware before, and they found, I think it was at least two like ancestors for things that would be in the Cambrian. One of them was specifically a bilaterian, which I brought up earlier, but that's just sort of you can imagine like a tiny little worm type creature, but it had bilateral symmetry. It's in the same group that we are. And yeah, so you do see, it's not like these things just like come out of nowhere, especially in like subsequent radiation events that we have. Like you can see like, okay, clearly this radiation, all these new species are coming out of this group from before. So like in like the Triassic radiations or events like that, we can see like pure predecessors in the previous layers of the fossil record. So I don't think that that's necessarily, I don't know. I disagree that the fossil record is quite so incongruous as maybe some of these intelligent design proponents might want to imply. And I would just personally, I think the fossil record is one of the strongest evidences for evolution, because specifically I would point to the ordering of the fossil record, right? We have got these Cambrian layers, these Ediacaran layers where like literally nothing like life that we have now. And just the sort of the ordering that we see these layers presented in there, I cannot see any other explanation that we would have these fossils in this order, in these layers, segregated out by species. They're not separated out by their mobility or their intelligence or their habitats. Like they're separated out into different layers according to species, which is like, there's no way to sort these things by species. For I think typically it's pointed to as a flood, right? That's the creation of the fossil record for most.
Well, certainly for young Earth creationists. Perhaps less so for old Earth creationists, or I mean, like ID proponents don't have to say there's a flood at all, but yeah.
I guess I have met sometimes where people say that there was like a sequential creation where maybe God created the Cambrian creatures all at once in the Cambrian, and then he created the Ordovician next, and he sort of created in order, I've heard.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would generally be if you want to be someone who is like a special creationist about the origins of like, at least like say phyla, right? So you're kind of hold to like a polyphyletic model of the sort of development of life. Then yeah, generally the way you're gonna interpret these different radiations and explosions is gonna be, okay, that's when God created that batch. That's when he created that batch. Maybe that's a little too simplistic, but I'll be honest, that was my understanding of
it.
Okay,
then let me push back on that specifically, because I think that evolution as a theory allows us to make predictions about what sort of transitional anatomic features we should observe in these fossils. Like we can predict what anatomies we should find in the fossil record before we find them. And so that's to where I could see that as being like an obvious, maybe not like strict defeater for the idea that God is creating each of these subsequently, but if we can predict what kind of anatomy these creatures are going to have before we know about them, I think that that's fairly strong evidence that these things, like if we use evolution to make these predictions and then they come true, that seems like evidence that evolution would be the explanation for why these fossils are in these order that we find them in.
And so that would be interesting.
So the specific example that I point to with that is Tiktaalik is probably the most well-known. So that's a sort of, I don't know if I have that book behind me, but it's sort of like in 2006, I want to say, Neil Shubin is this biologist, and he had noticed that there was a sort of a gap in the fossil record of like, how do we get from fish to the first land animals, right? And so there should be a transitional fossil that we could find for that. So he knew that it would have had to take place in the late Devonian period. So he kind of knew a bracket of between this many million years ago and this many million years ago. And he knew sort of, okay, it would be coming from lobed finned fishes. So we know what their anatomy would have looked like before. And then we know what the earliest tetrapods that were the first land animals. And so he was able to predict, well, it should look like a lobe finned fish with wrist bones and a neck, because that would be, you know, an anatomy that was intermediate between what we know of that fills either side of the gap, you know? And so because he predicted when that should occur, he knew what layers that should be. So he looked on a map, you know, where are these layers from this many millions of years ago? Where can we find those close to the surface so that we can just easily walk around and look for these fossils? And he found it in the very north of Canada called Ellesmere Island. It looks horrible, to be honest. Like all the pictures I've seen, there's no life, there's no plants. It's just a rocky, barren island in the far north of Canada. And they went there for like every winter for like a couple years, just walking around, looking for fossils. And eventually they found 3 of them, 3 different specimens of what they call Tiktaalik. And it's a lobe-finned fish with wrist bones and a neck, like primitive wrist bones. It could not support its own weight on its primitive little digits. It could not support its own weight. It could kind of like move around and flop around, but it had the very beginnings of like a wrist bone, and it's the only fish that has a neck. So it's like they predicted what anatomy, and they predicted where, in what layer they should find it. They went there, they found 3 of them. So it's like examples like that I think lend credence to the idea that these are not just, you know, if they can predict the anatomy beforehand using evolution, that's...
Yeah, so my understanding with Tiktaalik, and I mean, this is going to exhaust my knowledge of the subject, but the pushback, right, that I have seen on this point is that, like, you've got it with the morphology, so I'll grant you that one. But my understanding is that the location is wrong. It's that Tiktaalik is like 12 million years too late.
Yes.
If I'm understanding this correctly, because you've got like tetrapod footprints that were discovered in Victorian Poland. So yeah, it seems like you're familiar with it. So give me the response.
Okay, so basically the response is that Tiktaalik is not believed to be like the actual transitional animal that made that transition itself. It has the anatomy of one, which would make it closer to, I don't know, you're probably not familiar with the terminology of like clades, but it would make it sort of a sister clade, like a cousin sort of, that like a sister clade would have the similar anatomy as the transitional fossil, but it would just not have any descendants to the modern day. Or it would be, if its descendants would be like to a sister group. You know how evolution is full of branches? It would be one branch that wasn't the actual ancestral branch. But I have an update specifically for those Poland trackways.
Okay.
So yes, you have these creatures that have this predicted intermediate transitional anatomy. And they're from around the right time, but you're right. They're like 12 million years too late compared to the fossils of the footprints that we have, that are the earliest tetrapod footprints from Poland. The wrinkle in this story is that the Polish team that found those fossils has potentially found the fossil of the thing that made it, It still hasn't been published yet. They've just sort of been teasing like, by the way, with these trackways, we've found a lot of new fossil discoveries in the last couple of years, and we're writing it up right now. We're going to be publishing it like in the next year or two, where it seems like they have found either the fossil of the organism that made those trackways, or they have found species that were closely related to it. So it does seem like we will have that fossil record is going to be expanding a lot in the next couple years to come. I'm super excited to see what's from it. But basically, the idea is, in order for you to predict a fossil's transitional anatomy, you don't need to find the exact transitional species that is the ancestral one. I would say that a transitional fossil is just any fossil that has those intermediate anatomical features. It doesn't need to have had any descendants at all. Like if the fossil had 0 children and is not the actual ancestor for any populations today, it can still be a transitional fossil, or it can still have transitional anatomy.
I agree with that. I think the way it was initially being advertised, though, was like, yes, what we would predict this morphology, and we could predict the spot that we would find it, right?
And they did, yeah.
Well, it seems like it's not quite the right spot to get the neat sort of.
So I'll say the gap was about, I think, 30 million years or so when they started. So they've like the Polish trackways and Tiktaalik are both from that gap that they were looking in. But you're right, there's just like 18 to 12 million years of separation, but they're still within that overall window of when it was predicted that they find this transition. So yeah, I would still consider it. Maybe you would not consider them to have predicted the layer, but I think that like
I think you did predict the morphology, so I'll grant you on that one. Saying you predicted it in exactly the right spot, that seems to me a little more like if Tiktaalik was found early, if it was earlier than the tetrapod footprints, right? Than our earliest tetrapod footprints, I feel like that would. Like the look of that it would look a lot more plausible. It's not to say that that's an absolute defeater. It's just to say like that there is a little bit of a mix up there. And it's not to say you can't explain that. You can.
So we can look at maybe like an overall pattern of doing this multiple times, right? Because this is just the most famous prediction. And you might want to quibble with a detail or two, like saying, oh, it wasn't the exact right layer where they that kind of thing. But I do think like, it's difficult to make an argument against the overall pattern of this same kind of thing happening over and over again. Like the very first one, which is also probably the most famous, it was Darwin himself predicting Archaeopteryx, like 2 years before they found it. Like he predicted, that there should be a transition between, dinosaurs and birds, and then boom, you found Archaeopteryx with that transitional anatomy. But this has happened. This is what I think is the most powerful example, is that you can do this for yourself, where you can't predict the fossil before we find the fossil, but you can predict the fossil anatomy before you are aware of that fossil. So what you could do, I like to play this game, right? It does sort of require you knowing what clades are. So I'll kind of explain generally, but you can think of a clade as like any group where all the members of that group are more closely genetically similar to everyone in that group than anyone outside that group. So like mammals would be a clade. All mammals are more genetically similar to any other thing in the mammal group than anything outside the mammal group, right? Any canines are a clade because all the canines are more genetically similar to other canines than any non-canines. So does that make sense so far about like a clade?
Yeah.
In evolutionary terms, a clade would just be any group that all share like a common ancestor with each other. Like, and so okay. So that's a clade. So if you take any two adjacent clades, any two, so and by adjacent, I mean the clade that is the most genetically similar. So if we look at dogs as a clade, the next genetically most similar clade would be bears, right? So you take these two adjacent clades, dogs and bears, and what you would predict in evolution is that if you go and look at the fossil record, when you stop finding any dogs or bears in the fossil record, in the layers earlier than that, you should find dog-like bears and bear-like dogs. And then when you start going down even further, you should start to find nothing that you could even consider to be a dog or a bear or anything. But you start to find, I think it's carnivorans, carnivorans, where they have the traits that dogs and bears share in common, but they're sort of a more generalized version of these animals. They're sort of like you can find these transitional fossils in the fossil record for any two clades, and you can do this with any two adjacent clades that you can think of. Like you could do all of mammals, and then what's the most adjacent clade to all of mammals? Well, it would be all of diapsids. So that's like all the birds and all the like crocodiles and reptiles and everything. So like that's the whole adjacent clade to mammals. So then you have to look, okay, well, what are the traits that they have in common, and what are the traits that they have individually? And then you can trace it back to the fossil record and find a fossil that has in the place that it would be required for evolution, in like, I think in this case it would be the Carboniferous or maybe the Permian period, where you're no longer finding any mammals and you're no longer finding any birds or anything, and you're finding these fossils that share intermediate anatomical features with both of the clades. So it's like a kind of game that you could do to check if evolution is true or not. It's just pick any two random clades as long as they're adjacent, meaning they're more genetically similar to each other than any other living thing. And then you can look at the fossil record for those things and see them kind of converging on the same transitional kind of intermediate form in the past.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because like I agree with that like broad method that like if you could do that, that would confirm to some degree the theory of common descent. My understanding has been, and I realize like most of my reading on this has been from obviously people who are very like biased in the other direction, but my understanding has been like pretty generally like the fossil record does not give us that sort of and the examples that you can point to where like maybe it does, like Tiktaalik or Archaeopteryx, it's usually like kind of it's turning up in the wrong spot, or like there's usually some kind of wrinkle with it. So I mean, and I'm
not even aware of those, except maybe if you're saying like, oh, the Tiktaalik wrinkle is that it's not the exact ancestral population, it's a sister clade to it. Like a lot of the transitions are going to be probably sister clades, where we're going to have reasons to think that those were not our actual ancestors, those were just a sister group to it. Basically just in the way that evolution works, it's pretty much safer to assume that all of the fossils are sister clades rather than having direct ancestral relationships with the fossil. It's just safer bet, because the way that evolution works is that have these big radiations of all these new types of species, and then eventually coalesces into a handful of forms that persist.
Sure. I mean, I guess the challenge though is that when Archaeopteryx, for example, right, is appearing, what is it, like 125 million years earlier in the fossil record than what is it? There's like two fossils that are supposed to be its ancestors. I think it's like Sinosauropteryx and Caudy something. There's like, and they come up a bit. I think they're like 125 years younger, even though they're supposed to be the ancestors of Archaeopteryx.
So it's a little bit like, I think it's uncontroversial to say that dogs evolved from wolves.
Yeah.
But yet we still have wolves today. So like if you were to go today and say, well, here's a wolf, this is what dogs evolved from. We say, well, like this wolf doesn't even have any children, so how could dogs have evolved from it? You still have the ancestral forms persisting after the forms have evolved.
I'm agreeing with that, right? But it's that I think that's stronger if you like say you have those forms persisting, but then you also have them prior, right? So I'm not saying that the ancestral type should go out of existence once it's given rise to, say, Archaeopteryx. But I'm saying that what I would expect is that they would turn. And we realize the fossil record's not perfect, of course. So I'm not trying to put a ridiculous constraint on you guys here. I'm just saying I do think it's probably not quite as perfect as is being advertised.
Okay,
we're sort of maybe lacking the evidence that these forms actually were earlier than the things that they're supposed to have given.
So I would still push back. I recognize the point that you're making, but I would still push back on saying like the pattern of these transitional forms is important too. It's not like we're seeing fossils that have intermediate anatomy between like two things that evolution doesn't think are closely related at all, right? We don't see like some sort of like weird like half fish half grasshopper type intermediate forms. We're seeing the intermediate forms that would be predicted by evolution into where like I said, and I really do want you to do this challenge eventually. I'm not asking you to do it live on air, but like come up with two random clades that are adjacent to each other, humans and pannins, like chimpanzees and bonobos. Those are two different adjacent clades that are more similar to each other than any other animals genetically, just in terms of their genetic similarities. Those are two adjacent clades. So we can play this game with them. And then we go back, we look at the fossil record and we see, oh, well, here are more, chimp-like humans in the past. We can find these sort of history of these transitional forms. In terms of more like, I don't think our record for chimpanzee evolution is nearly as good because they evolved more so in the jungle, and we don't really have any fossils from like tropical rainforests or jungles in history because the soil's too acidic. But you can find like Australopithecus, you can find Homo erectus, you can find Sahelanthropus. Like there's all these missing links between humans and these more primitive like ape ancestors, and so you can find these transitional forms. And you're not seeing them where evolution would not predict you to find them, right?
Well, and I was kind of hoping we maybe get into hominids, although I realize we might be running out of time on this.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, but from what I have read on this, and I do need to watch Gibbons' videos kind of taking down some of like the creationist literature on this. But from what I did read in the creationist literature, we have similar sorts of wrinkles in like hominid fossils as well. Now I'm not like going to be as super confident in that, but just I'm saying from what I've read, it looks like the same sort of wrinkles that we see with like Archaeopteryx and stuff. And it's not always about timing stuff, right? Sometimes it's what's other issues like I think it's like Homo habilis is kind of like just like a junkyard category. It's argued
that's actually changed as well. I would point out,
okay,
it is very important to try, if you're going to try to look at like, well, what are the creationists saying in response to this evidence, and sort of like looking at the both sides. I do think it'll be important that you look at the date, like what date these are coming from, because I want to say this was earlier this year in 2026, but it might have been at the end of 2025. Again, super recent new finding. We found the most complete skeleton of Homo habilis that we have found yet. So it was like, for a huge years, Homo habilis was like, we didn't understand its anatomy that well because we just didn't have that many specimens. And this is the first specimen where we've gotten a good detailed look at the actual body of Homo habilis. And we found it's like the most transitional you could even imagine transitional anatomy being. Like its body is like, it's basically like got the body of an Australopithecus. Like, so like not even something of genus Homo. It's got like an Australopithecus body, but it's got a head that is not Australopith at all. It's like on its way to becoming, a very clear like Homo, like, it is a Homo head, but like there are people that want to argue that Homo habilis should be reclassified as Australopithecus because it's so transitional. Like it's like so transitional that people are like, can you even call this a Homo versus call this an Australopithecus? Because it's right in the middle. So like that, I really do think a lot of the creationist claims on this are oftentimes either based on misunderstanding or like outright misinformation.
Okay.
I do think Gutsit Gibbon is really good on this topic, and I will recommend that she's doing a series right now. And after this point, we can move on to the second half of the topic. But she's doing a series currently right now with creationist Will Duffy, and they're doing like every month they get together for like an absurdly long presentation. It's so many hours, but like they've done this for the whole year, and now they finally this month are getting to human evolution. And this is like her bread and butter. She's going to be doing like an extremely deep dive. Will is going to be like providing his pushback and stuff. And he talks to creationists after the month section. He brings back his gripes and they talk about it. And it's like, it's one of the best series I've ever seen on this subject. And like, I am super excited for her to finally get to the human evolution next month. So
yeah, Will is a personal friend of mine. So I have been following it as well. And I do like Erica because she's not smug. She seems like very understanding of the creationist side, but then like just gives facts to respond to it. obviously, what I think this has confirmed to me is that to sort of argue against this, it's almost like a full-time job, because like
Yeah.
you really do have to stay up with everything that's
Yeah.
on this. And I don't think I have like the time or the interest, like the inherent interest in evolutionary biology to stay up with that. But I mean, it is interesting because these sorts of conversations, I get like little updates as how like the field has progressed. And so perhaps someday I will come around to like embracing the sort of common descent position. I'm not anywhere near as hostile to it as I was, as a young Earth creationist. So these conversations do things to move me that direction. I'm just very, very slow about adopting new positions sometimes.
And this does very much align with my interest. I'm super fascinated by this material. So if you ever come across something where you're like, like I wonder like what would Grayson have to say about this, because this seems like a really good argument against evolution, like I would be all over that. If you send that to me, I'd be like, yeah, I want to know what they're saying, I want to know where the facts actually lie, and I'll look into it and I'll like respond to you. We can talk about it. So
yeah, appreciate the invitation there.
Cool. So to transition to the second topic here, we're going to be talking about the resurrection. And so it's a little bit different brand of evidence that we're going to be talking about, but we're going to talk about, does the evidence better align with a naturalistic account for, that explains the evidence that we have, the historical evidence, or, the gospel account, basically, the actual, supernatural resurrection? Does that better fit with the data? And what is more plausible maybe at the end of this? So I thought, since you laid out your position at the start of the last half, I'll lay down my position now of sort of where I'm at with the resurrection, and what I think is the most likely explanation. And so we kind of already knew about this. We talked about this originally. I sort of have altered my position as a result of of our previous discourse a little bit. So I'll get to that. So basically, I'll just start with 4 facts I think we should all be able to agree with. That Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. So I'm not like a mythicist or one of those people. I think his followers soon came to believe that he had been raised from the dead. So that is a fact that needs an explanation. There were some individuals or groups of individuals who claimed experiences with the risen Jesus. And this would include like Paul, potentially like Mary or Peter, others, the group of 500, whatever. And then 4, Christianity spread rapidly with only oral traditions for the first few years to decades before the Gospels were written. And so those are the first 4 facts that I think are fairly uncontroversial. And I think you're going to say the Gospels are earlier than I would say, but I think that overall, those are the facts I think we would all agree with. So in terms of explanation for these facts, I think that all of these facts can be explained through a combination of different like naturalistic phenomenon that we see elsewhere in human history. So like when I look at just the totality of human history, I see lots of different religious traditions around the world that all have like supernatural claims. A lot of them have supernatural claims surrounding their key figures, or specifically the deaths of their key figures. So I'm thinking about like the historical sources say that there are eyewitnesses attesting in court that they saw Romulus, ascending to heaven as a god. And then even Romulus comes and has some like post-transcendent appearances where he comes back down and interacts with people as a god. And that it was like you had eyewitnesses in court attesting to this. You have Muhammad riding up to heaven on a flying horse near his death. You have like Apollonius of Tyana had plenty of supernatural occurrences. He was a miracle worker in the 1st century. Like Joseph Smith had eyewitnesses, signed affidavits to some of his miraculous things with angels. You had the Buddha, who instead of dying dissolved into a bunch of flower petals or whatever. So I see all of these religious traditions in their historical texts and sources all making these supernatural claims, especially about their key figures, especially about them like transcending death in some ways or doing things like this. So I see this as sort of kind of ubiquitous. Like every culture on earth is making these supernatural claims of things that happen. Personally, I don't believe any of those. I think that they're, all of those cultural understandings came about through some variety of natural processes. So I would say either like, general religious experiences that people are having, sort of like grief hallucinations or hallucinations in general, over substances or whatever. And I'm not saying these as an explanation particularly for the resurrection. I'm saying for all of these. Some kind of combination of like a personal, vivid religious experience, whether it's induced by substances or grief or whatever, that we know that those kinds of religious experiences do happen in cultures around the world. And we know, cognitive dissonance can make something like if you have an expectation for something and it doesn't happen, you have cognitive dissonance to sort of reinterpret what led you to make that expectation or those kind of things. And then you have the sort of like spread of oral tradition that, preserves elements of the truth, but is also open to embellishments and those kinds of things. So I would consider like all of those supernatural beliefs from all of those various cultures around the world to have arisen through some combination of, religious experiences or visions paired with an unreliable or like embellished oral tradition, and then paired with like motivated reasoning on behalf of the religious adherents. So that's what I would consider to be an explanation, a naturalistic account for all of these traditions. So the question in particular is, why should I think specifically that the historical evidence for the resurrection and the Christian claims of the supernatural are privileged above the other cultures? And why is the supernatural a better explanation for that data, specifically for the resurrection, when I think you would probably agree with me that all these other religious traditions claiming these supernatural things is just those all came from like some sort of combination of naturalistic phenomenon creating that belief in those cultures over time. Although I guess, and this is the last thing I'll say, I know I've been going on for a while, I know some Christians would claim that there are demons or something, there's some supernatural explanation for all of these. I don't think that you would do that, but I'm not sure, so I'll just let you respond.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, it's a fair question to ask. And here's maybe the first thing I'll say is that if we're just trying to account for sort of the four facts that you put forward initially, without sort of putting any meat on the bones there, I might be willing to agree with you that you could explain it in, the sort of way that you've gestured at here. I don't know if you're familiar with a distinction. It's kind of like an in-house fight among Christian apologists over how is it we should argue for the resurrection. It sounds to me like what you're familiar with is what's going to be known as like a minimal facts approach to the resurrection, which is where we sort of list out 4 or 5 facts that like almost everyone accepts. And then we try to argue that the bodily resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation of those facts, right? And it'll probably include the ones you mentioned, along with, maybe the empty tomb or something like that. Now, I'm not persuaded that that's a successful argument, because it does seem to me that there are better ways to explain that than by appealing to the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Now, the way my argument for the resurrection works is I have to take on something a bit more controversial. And so this might be where you get off the boat. But I take it that our 4 canonical gospels are true to what the original eyewitnesses claimed. So I take it that Matthew and John are written by Matthew and John, for example. I think Mark is writing down what Peter told him. And I believe Luke when he says in the introduction that he got his information from eyewitnesses. So if that's the case, that we're dealing with eyewitness testimony in the gospels, I think that's going to preemptively sort of stave off this legendary embellishment idea, right? That you've got this oral tradition that's circulating and stuff gets added to it, and maybe it's not very reliable. I'm trying to sort of cut that off from the start. I'm going to say, no, like what we're dealing with in the Gospels That's what the eyewitnesses are saying happened. Now, we can fight about that premise, but let me just real quick explain how I get to the resurrection from there.
Okay.
I say, given that we have eyewitness testimony, you've got three options. They're either telling you the truth, they're lying to you, or they're honestly mistaken in some way. I do not think it's very likely that they're lying to you because there's this persecution that comes. In some cases, I think that they are martyred for these claims. That could be a point of contention between us. We'll see. But that's the main defense for that premise. I don't think it's likely that they're honestly mistaken. If you read sort of what the Gospels are telling you, right, about Thomas sort of touching Jesus's wounds, about them eating fish with him on the seashore. These are things that it's very hard to be honestly mistaken about. But if they're not lying and they're not honestly mistaken, your other option is that they're telling you the truth. So obviously, I do have to take something controversial on board there. That's going to be, that we're dealing with eyewitness testimony in the Gospels. But where that makes my task easier is that it's not as easy to gesture at, cognitive dissonance or grief hallucinations. It's harder to make those sorts of explanations stick with what the Gospels are telling us people experience. So is the distinction between the two arguments at least clear?
Yes, it is. So maybe I think we could approach this in two different ways. Maybe we could, and you could say which one you want to do first, because I, for the sake of the conversation, I think it might be interesting for me to just grant the reliability of the Gospels and just go from there. But I'm also like, to be honest with you, I'm not really willing to grant that. So we can maybe argue my actual position about which would kind of more turn into a discussion about the reliability of the Gospels. But I'm also like, I think it would be fun to just entertain what would happen if I were to concede that, okay, the Gospels are reliable, and then where do we do the conversation from there? So maybe we can do like those two things. I'm not sure which one you would want to do first necessarily, because
it probably makes sense to start with the eyewitness claim because that's an earlier premise in the argument, and then just be like, okay, maybe you haven't convinced me, but I'll take it on board, see where we go from there.
Okay.
I think that might be cleaner for the audience to follow the dialectic.
So, in terms of the eyewitnesses, the Gospels being eyewitness accounts, I would be the closest, like the most open-minded to Mark being reflecting an actual account of like Mark being the interpreter for Peter and writing down some of the things that Peter said without Peter's knowledge or whatever. And he didn't write it down in order or whatever it was. And then he like ordered this together after Peter's death or whatever is the consensus of that. That's the one I would be most open to being written by who it's traditionally ascribed to.
Okay.
For Matthew, I definitely don't think Matthew is written by the Apostle Matthew. We can get into my reasons why. Luke, again, I'm more open about Luke, but I don't know. I disagree. And again, you're more knowledgeable on this subject, so feel free if I've gotten something wrong, go ahead. But from my understanding about Luke's introduction, it doesn't sound like he's saying that he was writing it from eyewitnesses that he's interviewed. It sounded like he's like, all of my sources I can trace back ultimately to eyewitnesses. But it didn't sound like he was making a claim of talking directly to eyewitnesses himself. It sounded like he was making like, the people I talked to, they knew, they knew a guy that knew John, or they knew a guy that knew Jesus, or like, it sounded like he's saying ultimately you can trace them back to eyewitnesses. But it didn't sound like he was saying, like claiming that he was directly interacting with the eyewitnesses himself. And then John, I definitely don't think is by the disciple John. So that's sort of where I'm at with those three. Maybe we can get to, I know that you have fairly unorthodox or like at least non-consensus views about like Mark being the earliest written gospel, or some of these things that we could talk about, because I know like a lot of these arguments are going to be dependent on, well, if Mark is the earliest written gospel, then we can see like a clear sign of like embellishment going up to John, where John is like having this whole like, okay, well, here's how we really know it wasn't just a hallucination, because he's adding in these events of physical interaction and Jesus eating fish or whatever. Maybe that was Matthew, but so there's that issue of the Markan priority or whatever. The main issues I'll just stop with Matthew. Maybe we could just talk about Matthew first. I'm kind of going all over the place, but with Matthew specifically, the reason why probably my strongest reason for why I would think that Matthew is not written by Matthew would be okay. In Matthew, when he's describing the calling of Matthew, like when Matthew first meets Jesus, that passage just does not sound like somebody like that doesn't sound like how Matthew would write it. Like it sounds very detached. It sounds like it was written by somebody who is not Matthew, and the fact that it's also like word for word coming from Mark, or at least you would flip it and maybe say Mark is taking it from Matthew, which is alleviates the problem if it's the other way around. But in the consensus understanding where Mark predates Matthew, you have Matthew writing about Matthew's experience of meeting Jesus for the first time. It's very short. It doesn't go into that many details, and it's word for word the same as Mark, right? So to me, that just makes no sense. If this was actually written by Matthew, you would expect this part to feel the most personal, the most real. Like, this is my first interaction with God, the Son of God. It's like, if you'd think it would be a bigger than it is, right?
Yeah. So, I understand the point you're making there, because this was a little bit of a hang up for me too when I was first looking into this. So, I mean, here's some points to make there. I do try not to make the synoptic problem be like a whole issue here, because you're right. I do hold an unusual view here. I think that Matthew's the first gospel, Luke is the second one. I think Mark is actually the last of the synoptic gospels to have been written. I try not to make that like something you have to take on to buy my argument. I will bring it up though, like if someone tries to make, for example, an objection out of, well, it looks like Matthew copied his conversion experience from Mark. I don't agree with that, right? Because I do think that there are good reasons to think Matthew's the first gospel. I'll try not to make it about that, though. Maybe some other things we can say about that is, what about this whole, like, he's not using first person stuff, right? And it's pretty short. As far as it being short, I think we can explain that pretty easily. Like, he's trying to tell Jesus's story, not his own, right? So it's perhaps not so unexpected that the story is not like a huge centerpiece in the gospel. But as to like, now, why is it written in this sort of third person detached way? I understand that, because that's sort of not how we would write this, right? I do think it's important, though, to sort of get into the mind of the ancient person here. It is not all that uncommon for ancient authors to write firsthand accounts in that detached sort of way. The thinking was that makes it more official, that makes it more like a more professional account if you can detach yourself from it. And we do have examples of that. I'll go through three real quick, if that's all right.
Okay.
But you've got Thucydides. He was a general in the Peloponnesian War. He wrote a history of it. He's an eyewitness. He talks about himself in there, and it's all third person. Like, you would not get the impression reading it that, oh yeah, Thucydides is telling me like what he did and stuff. He just like, Thucydides will be like, Thucydides did this, did that.
Yeah.
Similar thing.
I will say real quick that my big problem is probably like, I would not have a problem as much with the calling to Mark section if it wasn't for the Mark and priority thing. Like, that's really the big issue for me, is that he's using the same words as Mark. And if Mark really does predate Matthew, I just think there can be no way that that's actually Matthew writing it if he's just copying what Mark said about his own first person experience. That's really more the issue I have with that, rather than
that it doesn't look like Matthew saying it.
The pronouns of we, or of him describing in a third person. Okay. I think the only issue where I take issue with like the wording like that is in John. I don't remember the exact section in John, but you probably know it, where he's talking about the beloved disciple, and he says like, we know this for the him. He calls John him, and then he identifies we as in like the writer, and so it seems like he differentiates the writer of John seems to differentiate himself from John in that passage. That's the only part of all the four gospels, I think, where I would take an issue with the actual like pronouns used.
Yeah, we can get to the last chapter of John there, just to maybe cinch up this bit on Matthew. Yeah. I mean, I don't like, if that's the big hang up, then there's honestly not another way to proceed forward other than for me like to defend the idea that I think Matthew's the first gospel, and I don't know how deep you want to get in there. I'll maybe just say like one thing in favor of that, because you mentioned that you like kind of early Christian history.
Yeah.
I do think it's noteworthy. Literally every single patristic source, like from Papias on through St. Augustine, every single one of them says Matthew is the first gospel to have been written. They disagree on all kinds of stuff, right? Like Clement of Alexandria, he agrees with me that Luke is the second gospel written. Origen disagrees with him. He thinks Mark is the second gospel written. So they have a lot. They disagree over like when is Mark written, right? Irenaeus seems to say it's after the death of Peter, whereas Clement is very clear it's during the life of Peter. So like they're happy to disagree with each other on all kinds of stuff. And yet, across all of them, every last one of them says that Matthew's the first gospel to have been written.
So my position on that is that I kind of think that our Matthew is not that same Matthew that they're referencing. And the reason I would point to this is one of the sources that you listed, Papias, because when he talks about the Gospel of Matthew, he says that Matthew wrote it in Hebrew. But then when we look at the Gospel of Matthew as we have it, it was clearly not, like, it's not translated from Hebrew. It's clearly originally written in Greek. So, like, the fact that whatever Gospel of Matthew that Papias is talking about is written in Hebrew, it seems like it's just a different gospel than the one that we have today.
So I have two thoughts on that. The first one being, if you are open to that there was a original gospel of, like, Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, that might afford you a way to maintain Markan priority and get rid of this problem. Because what you could say is that in his Hebrew gospel, Matthew relayed his account, and then Mark took it over, and then whenever our Gospel of Matthew was updated or whatever, and you want to say maybe it used Mark plus brought over some of this stuff from Hebrew Matthew, you could maintain this is Matthew's account through and through and through, right? It's carried over from Hebrew Matthew to Mark to Greek Matthew. That's not what I believe happened, because I don't believe that there was a Hebrew Matthew. I do not.
You think that Papias was just mistaken?
I don't think he's saying that. Actually.
Oh.
So I think that the Greek term that he uses there could be translated as Hebrew language, but it can also just mean in a Hebrew style or dialect.
Okay.
And the context of what Papias is doing there is he's contrasting the style of Mark with Matthew, saying that, like, Mark is not written in order, but Matthew is written in order. So I think that favors the translation of this, as he's saying Matthew wrote in a Hebrew style, or a style that will appeal to Hebrews. We can actually see that in our Gospel of Matthew. It's a very Jewish gospel. It's, very big on proving Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. So that's my view. I think that's been a misunderstanding of Papias. We don't have to.
Since I'm definitely not an expert in Greek, I basically, in order for me to put more credence on what you're telling me right now, I would want to hear it from somebody that's actually an expert in Greek, backing up the things that you're saying. But I'm not opposed to it.
Yeah, I can give you sources. This is this was first put forward by a German scholar named Joseph Kurtzinger. He was not an evangelical Christian, So this is not just something that they say. It's been more recently supported by scholars like Robert Gundry, Larry Chenard, very recently in, like, kind of the newest big commentary on Matthew, William Varner, he defends that view. So it is defended by some heavyweight scholars.
Would this take then also, because I thought that all four Gospels were originally written in Greek then, so would this basically, in order for Mark to be partly based on like an original Hebrew Gospel of Matthew or something, are there parts of the Gospel of Mark that scholars think are based off of original, like, Hebrew or Aramaic sources? Because I'm not aware of that.
Yeah, not that I know of. There are these things called Hebraisms that turn up in all of the Gospels, and what these are is they're like Hebrew words that have been transliterated into Greek. So they're not like native Greek words. They're Greek transliterations of stuff from the Hebrew. You have some of that, and it turns up in all of the Gospels. Some people think maybe that indicates the Gospel writers were working from Hebrew sources.
Okay.
But I don't see the need to go that far.
Okay. Yeah, so that was just sort of why I was skeptical about Matthew specifically.
Sure.
And then, yeah, like I said, I'm more open-minded about Luke and Mark,
Okay.
because, yeah, I mean, the intro to Luke kind of gets me. It kind of seems like some guy trying to set forward, his methodology for how he's writing this, how he's getting this information. It just seems like if there was an introduction to Mark or an introduction to Matthew that was more of this like first person or like explaining who the author is. So I guess the only time we really have that is at the beginning of Luke and then in John with that part that we discussed, right? With where he draws a distinction between the beloved disciple and then we
who know that his testimony is true.
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, I could tell you what I think's going on there.
Okay.
What I think's going on here is that these last two verses are added to the Gospel of John after the Apostle John died. And the reason I think that is the immediately prior verse. You've got this story about sort of Jesus tells Peter that he's going to die as a martyr, essentially. And then they ask, like, well, what about like this other disciple, right? The disciple that you love. What about John? And Jesus says, if I want him to live till I come again, like, what's that to you? Follow me. Then the narrator jumps in there and is like, so for this reason, a rumor went out among the brethren that the disciple who Jesus loved would not die until Jesus returned. But he didn't say that. He only said, like, if I want him to live, then, like, what's that to you? And then it says, this is the disciple who wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. So the way I read that is that the verse is affirming that John the Apostle wrote these things. I mean, it does say that this is his testimony, and he wrote these things. But then we know that his testimony is true. That suggests to me that these two verses here are added in probably after John died, and in response to this rumor that he was supposed to live until Jesus comes back. And so it's very, like, it's trying to correct that rumor. Is sort of why those verses are there.
Okay. I mean, you've given certain reasons for why you think that was like an interjection that was not written by the original author, but you understand how it kind of like my initial feeling on that is just it sort of feels kind of like a cherry picking of like, well, when it's this stuff that fits the narrative, then that was written by John the disciple, and then when this doesn't really align with it, then it's like that wasn't written. That was somebody else writing that. And I know that like the consensus of biblical scholars does sometimes find these passages that are like later injections, like the ending of Mark. So I know that does happen. To be honest, I don't know enough about all the reasons for why the scholars think that the ending of Mark was added on. I think it was just like not in the early manuscripts, maybe. But
that's the main reason why that and the style diverges from.
Okay,
like, the Greek diverges from what's in the earlier parts of the gospel.
Okay, but I guess we don't have in all of our earliest manuscripts with John that those would be later, and those were all contained the passage in question, right?
Yeah, well, sorry, I got distracted by modern atheism's comment there. What were you saying?
So I was saying that like the earliest manuscripts that we have for John do contain this section in question, right?
Yes. We don't have any textual evidence that it's not. I will say, though, it is pretty widely acknowledged that something is up with the last chapter of the Gospel of John.
Okay.
There are scholars who think the entire, like all of John 21 is added to the Gospel later on. I don't go that far, but I do think that these two verses are. And again, the reason why is just because I think it is suggested by the verse itself, right? It says that the disciple who Jesus loved, it says he wrote these things, and then it says, and we know that his testimony is true. So what you have stated there is that the disciple who Jesus loved, that he wrote these things, and then like an apparent distinguishing of the person writing this verse from the person who wrote the rest of the gospel. So like I'm not trying to cherry pick. I think that is that's the interpretation that the verse itself is trying to give you.
Okay.
It's trying to tell you that the disciple who Jesus loved wrote the gospel.
I've
and like sort of
I've heard, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was saying that I've heard, I don't know if this is the consensus, but I have heard at least like a strong undercurrent of the scholarship is that there was some sort of like community in Anatolia, because it does seem like in early Christian like history that some groups of Christians held to all four gospels, but a lot of them, if not the majority, held to just like one gospel. And like the gospel in Anatolia that was the most popular was John's, and the gospel in the Levant was like Matthew's, I think, or Luke's maybe. Like Marcion is famous for saying only Luke's gospel is the only true one. And so there was like this early period of Christianity, like you had all of these different versions of the gospels, and like the gospel of John, I've heard at least some scholars saying is like, was basically written by this Johannine community that had cropped up, like maybe has foundational roots with the disciple of John. Maybe there are certain writings that they have preserved of things that he said, and then it's the Johannine community after a few generations that's compiling this all together and making the actual like gospel of John. And that would seem to fit in with what they're saying there at that text of like, oh, John wrote these things, we're passing down like traditions that go directly to this disciple of John, but saying like, we as in we are not that guy. I don't know. I had heard that there was like some sort of idea of that this was
community gospel
derived by a Johannine community.
Yeah, I mean that term definitely turns up in the literature. I don't think that like the idea that these are community gospels is strong enough to be considered consensus.
Okay,
there definitely are scholars who hold that position, and there are other scholars who argue against them. My take, though, is that verse kind of does argue against it, right? At least that the whole gospel, because it says that like the apostle, like one person wrote these things. And then you do have this, we know that his testimony is true. I'm fine with that, like reflecting like the posture of a community afterwards. But again, I just want to restrict it to those two verses because they do directly say that the apostle wrote these things, right? Mm-hmm. So it's attributing the vast majority of it to a single author.
It is really curious too, and I don't know the answer to this. This was not something that I thought I was going to ask you, but like, why do you think it didn't specify who the beloved this apostle was? Like, it seems like weird that it would be sort of vague enough to say this was written by the beloved disciple or whatever, but not say which one that is.
Yeah, I think that I think there are hints as to who it is, particularly if you compare it to the other gospels, right? For example, going up into the upper room with Jesus, we know that it's like Peter, James, and John. The Gospel of John just says it's Peter, James, and the disciple who Jesus loved. So like you can pretty well figure out it's John from comparing it with other gospels. As to why it doesn't tell you directly, I mean, none of the gospels do, right? I think that it was like known to the people. That's always how the Gospel of John was received, as far as we can tell, like literally everyone. In fact, this is bleeding in. I'm passionate about this because this is bleeding into a study I've been doing recently. But we have so many early witnesses who attribute this to someone named John, right? Even like the Valentinian Gnostics. I think I tracked down four of them prior to Irenaeus. So like from 135 to 165, who are all attributing this to an apostle named John, right?
But okay, wait, really quick. Are they attributing it to an apostle named John, or like, because there's a lot of different Johns in that area. Like, I know that there's a controversy with, like, I think Papias might be the very first person to attribute the Gospels to, like, Mark and to Matthew and John maybe. But Papias seems to mention, like, multiple different Johns. Like, there's John the Elder, there's John the listed among the apostles. And I looked it up, and I think I did read that, like, John was the most popular Hebrew male name in the first century. So it's like there's a lot of Johns all over the place. Like how if there's a lot of if there's even like a John the Elder who's like an important John in the area at the time in the church, it's like I don't know. It seems difficult to try to attribute this all to John the Apostle specifically.
Okay, yeah, a lot there. To answer the initial question, it is clearly John the Apostle in at least two of these sources.
Okay.
So Heraclian had the earliest known commentary on the Gospel of John. Doesn't exist today because he was a Gnostic. But Origen preserves like some parts of it in his own commentary. And in one part, he quotes, it's clear that Heraclian thinks it's John the Apostle. We have another guy from the same Valentinian school of Gnostics. His name was Ptolemy. He attributes it to someone named John. He doesn't say apostle, so I'll grant you on that one. But the name does stay the same. And then another bit of evidence we have from Clement of Alexandria, he sort of keeps some quotes from the Valentinian Gnostics. One of them quotes the Gospel of John and then attributes it to the apostle. So we don't get the name John, but we do get that they thought it's from an apostle. Now, regarding the other issue you brought up about does Papias draw a distinction between John the Apostle and John the Elder, that's an argument that Eusebius makes in Ecclesiastical History, Book 3. He's pretty motivated. It's a wonderful bit of motivated.
I remember he thinks like, doesn't he say that like Papias is an idiot basically? Like,
yeah,
he's like...
he says he calls him a man of low intelligence. And the reason for that is they had disagreements over the nature of the millennium. So Papias thought it was literal. Eusebius hated that position. And so everyone up to Eusebius thinks that Papias knows the Apostle John. They don't make there's no distinction between John the Apostle and John the Elder until we get to Eusebius, who's like, well, I don't want this idea to have apostolic credibility. So I need to distance Papias from John the Apostle. And so he kind of goes to town in Book 3 of Ecclesiastical History, making this argument for why actually there's John the Apostle and John the Elder. As I said, it's a wonderful bit of motivated reasoning. I don't think his argument succeeds, but that's where the
personally, I have not read Eusebius. I've read the translations of what Papias has said, and just reading Papias's words, that's where I got the impression that these are different Johns, because he specifically lists out all the apostles by name. And then he lists out the elders, and like John has specified John the Elder there with some other guy that had a really cool name, like Aristian. Yeah, awesome name. But like it seems like he separates them out when he's making a list, and they seem like just a natural reading of that. Granted, I don't read the original language it was written in. That's a good caveat here. But just reading it, the translation in English, it just strongly comes across to me that he's describing two different Johns in that list.
That's definitely the impression Eusebius wants you to get. I'll tell you how I read it.
Again, I haven't read Eusebius on this. I just know that he's called him an idiot.
Yeah, here's what Papias actually says is that like if anyone came to me who had heard the elders, I would like inquire about the words of the elders.
Yes.
And he goes through their list, right? Like what did Philip say, or what did Thomas said, or what did John said, or what did Peter said?
Yeah.
And then he says, or what John or the elder John was saying, or Aristian was saying. Mm-hmm. So the way I read it is that I think John is still alive while Papias is writing. And so the reason why this stuff is like past tense and this stuff is present tense is he's saying he inquired of people like what had the apostles said. And then he says, what were John or Aristian, who are still alive, what are they saying? So it's not that there's two Johns here, on my view. It's that he's inquiring people about like what had John said in the past and what is John still saying in the present. I think that's a perfectly legitimate way to read that passage. So it doesn't have to be read as that there's two Johns. And one further point is that if that's the best Eusebius has, he doesn't have a very good reason to think that there's two Johns. Because if that's the most definitive statement he can pull out to prove that there's two Johns, and that one's like, you could go either way, I think he's biting off more than he can chew if he's going to be confident that there's a distinction. Oh, and one other thing. The same term that he uses to talk about the elder John and Aristian, he uses the same word to refer to the list of apostles. He says the elders, Philip, and like...
Okay.
So that's another thing, is that the same term that he is using interchangeably with apostle is used for both Johns.
Okay. Well, You know, I'm open to being wrong, but that was just my natural reading of Papias's quote there, was that it just seemed very much my natural reading in the translation into English, at least. I can see your argument. It seems like a bit of a stretch to me on the face of it, but it's not like, I don't think it's like implausible, I guess. Or it's like, I don't think you're like totally off base here. Before we go on to the next part where I'm just going to accept gospel reliability and then we can go from there. I just wanted to highlight this comment so that you can maybe respond, because I think I can come up with some good evidence that the Gospels existed prior to the mid-2nd century. Like this person said, there's no evidence that the Gospels existed prior to then. What kind of evidence would you point to address this person?
Yeah, I mean, we've got all sorts. We can start with manuscript evidence for the Gospel of John, P52, pretty standardly dated to 125. There's some scholarship trying to push it a bit later than that. But I mean, at 125, we all agree John is the latest of the Gospels. So if the Gospel of John existed in 125, the other Gospels existed before it. That's certainly prior to the mid-2nd century. We've also got fragments of the Gospel of Matthew, 3 in particular. It's called the Magdalene Papyrus. There is some evidence that would date that to the 60s AD, which would definitely put the Gospel of Matthew in the 1st century. More than this, you've got Clement of Rome's letter to the Corinthians. He definitely quotes Matthew and Mark and probably Luke in one place. Mainstream dating puts that letter at 96 AD. I think it should be put a bit earlier. I would date it to the right before 70 AD. But wherever you put it, First Clement is definitely a 1st century letter, and it's familiar with the 3 synoptic gospels. So if First Clement knows them in the 1st century, then the synoptic gospels have to be earlier than that. We have to talk about Papias himself, right? Papias is, I think he should be dated to the 90s. Of course, that's debatable. But if Papias himself is a 1st century source, I think he knows all 4 gospels. That puts all 4 gospels earlier than that. There's so many more lines.
Yeah. No, I thought that was a really good in-depth response to that person. So I'm glad that you could kind of give the rundown there. Before we move on, though, I do want to say, I am noticing a little bit of something that is a kind of a red flag for me, is that you seem to have a lot of disagreements on certain scholarly consensus, to where when that happens once or twice, I'm like, okay, but then it's if you keep having not necessarily fringe views, but sort of minority views over and over and over again, that's going to start to raise my red flags and be well, wait a minute, because the odds that you would be correct and the consensus of scholars or experts would be wrong on one issue is one thing, but when it compounds with every single issue that you're disagreeing with, right? So that's why it's a little bit of a red flag. Be well, wait a minute, why is this person disagreeing with the consensus of experts so frequently on all of these dating issues?
I get that. I think though maybe 2 things could be said to mitigate the worry there. So one of them would be that I think you could boil a lot of the disagreement down to one single disagreement, and that's going to be how much value do we put in the testimony of the patristics? Because my philosophy of approaching history is I want to see what the earliest sources say. That doesn't mean I'm going to uncritically accept whatever they say, but that's going to be given weight. And regrettably, there's a very dismissive attitude in contemporary biblical scholarship towards the patristic. It's basically assumed that they're just legendary and unreliable. So we'll brush them aside. There's some stock arguments they'll trot out for that, but I don't think that they're very good. So kind of this one point of disagreement is doing a lot of work, because if you take the patristics seriously, they're going to give you traditional authorship. They're going to give you early dates for the Gospels. So there's a lot of material that if you think that the patristics are trustworthy, that's going to really affect how you weigh a lot of.
So how does this translate to your approach to the Quran or something, right? Where you have fairly early after the life of Muhammad, you have like the Quran during, what was it, the reign of Abu Bakr or something. I think it was finalized into like the version of the Quran that is similar to what we have today. So that seems to be pretty quick, like in terms of like a handful of years in between. So how much stock do you put on like the historicity of the Quran or the hadiths or things like that?
I mean, not that much.
Okay. So like, why not, I guess, is my question.
Well, because it's not just about early dates, right? Like early date does not get you. I mean, I don't think it gets you as much as a lot of people think an early date gets you. As it happens, I think that we can date a lot of like the books of the New Testament considerably earlier than they are maybe standardly dated. That's not even really important to my resurrection argument. I happen to think that that's true. But I mean, early dates only gets you to that, like somebody not too far after the events was saying this stuff. The more interesting things to me is like, is that corroborated by other sources? Are there good reasons to think that the source is reliable? I got none of that with the Quran, right? The Quran's not corroborated by other sources. I have no reason at all to trust that the sources behind the Quran are trustworthy.
Well, wait. What do you mean? But like, we do have the historical sources for like the expansion of Islam, right? And so like, like we know Muhammad, like we have I think a Christian source written in the margins of a Bible or something about like Muhammad is at the gates kind of a thing, like in Syria, like in the 630s. Like we do have some corroborating historical sources for like the rise of Islam or whatever. So I guess,
well, I assumed we were talking more about like the miraculous stuff in there, right? Like,
so what are the extra historical sources? Like, what are the historical sources that validate the supernatural claims of the Gospels then?
Well, for one, is that the Gospels are not like, it's not one source, right? That is 4 sources. So that I take it.
Well, I don't know if you could say it's 4 sources, right? Because like the wording in the Synoptic Gospels is at least like, you know, if they're not all cribbing from Mark, they're all cribbing from Matthew or whatever the priority you want to play out, but they are like verbatim large quotes. Like they are not independent.
So in certain parts, I'll grant that, right? Like if we want to talk about feeding of the 5,000 or the healing of Peter's mother-in-law, what have you, I'll agree that like maybe Mark and Luke don't have anything besides Matthew for that. When we get to the resurrection, though, this is an interesting thing. All of the synoptics get the most different when they get to the Passion Week, when they get to Jesus' crucifixion. We have like really like literary dependence goes away almost completely.
Doesn't that seem like it would be more reflective of the fact of like having different oral traditions in different geographic areas? Like doesn't that seem to explain those differences in the resurrection accounts more than
you
like,
can go that route?
If this was an actual thing that actually happened, would we expect there to be those differences in the accounts of the resurrection among the Gospels? I don't really know if we would.
Well, I mean, maybe it depends on what you mean by differences. If you're alluding to contradictions, we could certainly get there, because I'm probably going to not agree that there are contradictions the way that perhaps you would. But remember, the point was you were saying, I don't think that they're independent of each other.
Yes.
And so I'm saying, actually, on like this really critical point, like the thing that we're presently interested in, the resurrection, that's when they get the most independence. So if you want to say maybe they're not independent about some stuff earlier on, fair play.
Yeah, at least at the very... I don't think you can claim independence if, like, at the very least they've read the other, like if they're quoting from some other work, they've read that other account, so that you can't really claim it's independent. Even if like you might say, well, their resurrection claims seem independent, but I don't know. It's not really independent if they've read the entire previous source. You know what I mean?
How about partially independent, or
maybe partially independent,
or they have independent sources they're working from.
Because like that would be to say, like, if I were to write like I'm a big Game of Thrones fan. If I were to write my own fanfic of Winds of Winter that isn't out yet, it's the 6th book, and so it's like, oh, well, this is totally not in George R.R. Martin's text or whatever, and it's totally independent of, like, you know, I based it off all of the stuff that I read previous to that led up to that book that I like didn't have yet. So I don't know if I don't like this word of independent sources, because like they knew about each other. They've clearly read each other, or at least, you know, they've read a previous source or whatever. So
you would say John at least is independent, right?
Yeah, I mean, I just don't know, because like, did they read the other previous the other previous gospels, or like have they not read any of them? Are there similar oral traditions that overlap both of them to where like they might be independently developing from a common source or something? I'm not sure. So I don't know if I feel like them calling them independent, even with
John is not as obviously dependent. Like whether you think Matthew or Mark is the first gospel, he's not as obviously like dependent on the synoptics as the synoptics are.
So maybe just because we are sort of like a bit over time here, maybe we could just, I will just, for the last section here, if I were to just grant the reliability of these gospels, and if I were to say like the differences are not rising to the level of like, it would be contradictory, and it's just like, it's whatever, it's just details that are like different, or there's some way to harmonize these accounts. If I were to just accept that the gospel writers are who they're attributed to, and these gospels are like historically reliable, if I were to just grant that, then you're saying then the actual supernatural like resurrection would best account for these gospels, and you're saying that that would make it sort of rise to a level that we don't see on any other cultures or religions and their supernatural beliefs.
What I'm saying is, given that what we're reading in the Gospels, given that is what the original eyewitnesses were claiming, that's when we have to deal with they're either lying to us, they're mistaken in some way, or they're telling us the truth. And so where I think the resurrection comes out ahead of other religions is that we have much better reasons to think that they're not lying and that they're not honestly mistaken. Or in some cases, that what they're reporting here is going to genuinely be miraculous if true. Because there are some religions where, like, I could grant that they're not lying or honestly mistaken, but even granting that, like, I don't have to appeal to a miracle to explain what they're saying. I don't think that's going to work in this case, though, because, like, if what the Gospels are telling us about, like,
what is it about that, like, what is it that you think is in these gospel accounts that, like, either cannot be explained through naturalistic causes, or like is explained less well by naturalistic explanations than it would be by an actual supernatural resurrection?
Are you saying if we're granting that it's not a lie?
Yeah, like what is it that is in these gospels that, if it actually is reliable historical eyewitness testimony, that then it would be better explained by a real resurrection than by any naturalistic causes?
Yeah, it's the details that are being reported there, right? So specifically the things like touching Jesus, the being with him for 40 days afterwards, eating with him, grabbing his feet, right? That one is in Matthew. This sort of stuff is what's resistant, I think, to naturalistic explanation. Because, like, I think if you're going to say that, yeah, they genuinely thought they experienced this stuff, and you don't want to say it really happened, your best bet there is going to be hallucination. That's going to run into issues like the empty tomb, which, remember, we're going to have to grant if we're saying that this is honestly mistaken. So you have problems with an empty tomb. You have problems with them touching Jesus. I think it's something like 2% of grief hallucinations involve any sort of touching component. So it's very rare. And you have to have multiple people at one time doing this. So I think if we grant that this is what the original eyewitnesses claimed, and that they're not lying to us, it's going to be really hard to say that, to find a way that they can just be honestly mistaken about this stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand this argument. I mean, so I'm like looking at sort of analogs from other cultures or other religions, and I'm seeing, like, there are eyewitnesses to miracles in Mormonism that, they were also persecuted. I'm not sure why those eyewitnesses, what their motivation would be to lie about what they saw there. I also know of like the Marian apparitions, like in Zaytum or Fatima or whatever, where you have these, I don't believe that those are actual miracles. I don't know if you believe in Marian apparitions or not, but those are like hundreds of people claiming to see something, that I don't know if they're trying to claim to see this, like, Mary appearing in this supernatural appearance, or like the sun changing in crazy miraculous ways, and you have like hundreds of people purported to be eyewitnesses to these things. And in terms of the 2% is a higher than I would have thought for like tactile grief hallucinations. I think that specifically in this context, I think that it's a little bit dislike regular like bereavement hallucinations, where you have a lot of motivational reasoning here, where like these were Jesus's followers that were convinced that he was the Messiah that was like going to fulfill certain purposes, and they were not expecting him to die, right? Like there was a strong expectation for what role the Messiah had. They had some sort of expectation for what Jesus was going to do, what their mission was. They had like, you know, there's going to be a certain degree of cognitive dissonance when your Messiah is killed. Like that was not predicted by at least the apostles. Like that was a surprise to them. Like you could say Jesus was predicting it or whatever, but it didn't seem like that was an expectation that anybody else had. So it's like, there seems to be like, I mean, that's like a very extreme environment of like being in like cult is kind of offensive, but it's like it's a small religious group, right? Like that had a leader that everybody was expecting to be the savior. It's like cults, like the cult members report a lot of crazy mystical experiences, especially surrounding their leaders or whatever. Like they've experienced their leader doing all kinds of miraculous things that I can't really account for, other than like they're just either lying or mistaken. I don't know what it is. Like I know I'm kind of rambling here, but the point I'm trying to make is when I look at all these other cultural contexts or all these different like examples of cults or religious figures or whatever, it seems like their followers are always seeming to report having witnessed all of these supernatural miracle claims and stuff. And I just don't know why this particular one would be prioritized as like, well, the supernatural does actually account for this one better than the naturalistic explanations, which account for all those other ones better. You know?
Yeah. The reason why, the short answer why, right, is that there's going to be better reasons in this case for thinking that they're not lying and that they're not honestly mistaken. That's the short answer. Of course, It takes a lot of room to unpack it, but that is my short answer to that question. I'm happy to go through like why I think lying is actually perfectly plausible in the case of Mormonism, and why even if they're not lying, like what they're reporting is not particularly miraculous in the case of Mormonism. We can go through Fatima, right, and how you've got differences in the witnesses, right? You've got people who said, yeah, like we saw the sun doing some funky shit, but like we didn't think that, like I didn't think it looked miraculous. A lot of those witnesses saw the same thing the very next day when like the conditions were very similar and nobody thought it was a miracle. So I mean, there's a lot of these things. The more you look into them, the more it's easier to like say, okay, like people are lying here, or there are honest mistakes are plausible, or in some cases, like maybe they really saw it and it just wasn't miraculous, right?
I see. That's a really, really good answer. And the reason I like it so much is that's almost the exact answer that I would give if I was more articulate to like the resurrection accounts, where I could come up with some reasons why I think that they would be lying or why they would be honestly mistaken, or the differences in their accounts that like don't seem to add up. Like, you know, if Mark is really writing down things that Peter said, Peter just never mentioned any of the post-resurrection appearances. Like he never talked about them. He never talked about meeting Jesus like after the resurrection. That just seems really strange to me. If like, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I do have a theory as to why that's the case. I don't know if you want me to get into it, but
I mean, we are kind of approaching the 2-hour mark. I think we're
going to do questions as well. So
yeah, there's like, well, we don't have that many questions. I think there was only like one super chat that I wanted to highlight from Modern Day Atheism. I think shout out Swan, by the way. I think he's friends with both of us. Yeah, he said, can you look at the genetic entropy argument that Standing for Truth has been making? Well, I don't know. I've made videos on genetic entropy before. I don't know. Is Donnie making a new argument about genetic entropy? It just sounds like he makes the same argument.
Anything to what Stanford said on that?
Yeah, and I mean, Dr. Dan and Zach Hancock have a great paper where they basically just debunk the very concept of genetic entropy. So yeah, I don't know if I'll make a video on that. I might, if Donnie's genuinely putting forward a new argument that I'm not aware of, I I might make a video addressing that one. But thanks for your super chat, by the way. But yeah, I did kind of want to keep this to be under 2 hours. Maybe we can have subsequent discussions or something, because there's still there's a lot on the table that we haven't gotten to.
For sure.
So yeah, maybe we'll have to do another one of these. But I didn't want to take up too much time. So, David, do you got anything coming up on your channel, or anything that you want to plug or tell the people here? Again, your channel is Faith Because of Reasons, right?
Faith Because of Reason, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much interest it'll be to your particular viewership here. I know Modern Atheism will be interested in this one. But I do have 2 videos in the pipeline. So one is going to be, I just recently did like a really long video critically analyzing the case for sort of dating the Gospels late and why I think they should be dated early. I'll be doing a similar one, taking on the idea that the Gospels were originally anonymous. And so explaining why I don't think that the evidence supports that, and finding some stuff that I've been excited about, that like some stuff that hasn't been talked about as far as I can tell for like 120 years that I think that should come back to light. So I'm excited about that. The other one, I'm hoping to have this one out in December, is going to be sort of a defense of Christmas. So like, what the heck is going on with like the Magi following a star? Does that make any sense, right? Did Luke get something wrong with the census under Quirinius?
Oh, okay. I'm very interested in these ones. Okay.
Is an incarnation even logically possible? So just sort of all things Christmas. It'll just be kind of scattershot of that. I'm hoping I have that done by December. So kind of
very cool
for Christmas.
Oh, Feliz Navidad. Yeah, that sounds like some fun videos in the pipeline. So yeah, check out Dave's channel. Look forward to those videos. I am. In terms of this channel, I know a lot of you guys are going to be wondering, like, do I have any videos coming up in the pipeline? I would like to do more of these live streams where I get to talk with like Christian apologists or creationists or anyone that I find interesting to talk to. So I would like to do that. Currently, I don't have any plans to do a scripted video, but yeah, I want to do more live streams coming up. So if basically this was you guys can thank Dave for this, because we were in the emails, and then Dave reminded me of this conversation. So yeah, I need more Christians or theists just like challenging me more to discussions. Dave's one of the only ones that pulled through with an email actually trying to set something up. So yeah, very grateful for that, because this was a great conversation. I'm very happy about this. So and then one last question from Phantom about any trash talk streams. So there were just too many technical difficulties. I actually lost my phone at the end of the last trash talk stream, and I had to go buy a new phone because of how difficult it was trying to figure out like streaming outdoors. I ended up dropping it in a pipe. It was terrible, but and it perfectly fell, like swish, nothing but net, right through this pipe that was in the middle of nowhere outdoors. But anyways, if I can figure out a way to like that's technologically feasible to stream outdoors picking up trash, then I will do that again as soon as possible. But I couldn't get the technology to work at the time, so that's why there hasn't been any of those. But yeah, thank you guys for all the love in the comments. I definitely want to get back on this channel more than I have been. So yeah, look forward to that. No plans on going anywhere. I want to have more of these discussions like this. So with that being said, Dave, everyone that was here for the audience, thank you guys for coming here. This is a great conversation, and hopefully one of many more to come. Anyways, have a great day, folks.